The second person I really wanted to be a part of this, and I'm so glad she could do it, is Michele Steeb, who's going to be offering our second keynote. I was actually first introduced to Michele through her very important book, which you see listed here in the agenda, Answers Behind the Red Door, Battling the Homelessness Epidemic. And as we think about the broader arc of this event, we've started with looking at the government response. We're going to transition now to the work of nonprofits, and Michele's background really spans those sectors. She has led a shelter. At the same time, she has worked with government and understands really the different roles that each can and should be playing. Michele has been involved in this work for decades, is a native Californian. The book that I just mentioned that she wrote profiles her work with a shelter called St. John's, which is up outside of Sacramento, and she now speaks widely and nationally, writes widely on issues related to homelessness. And so please join me in welcoming for the second keynote, Michele Steeb.
Okay, I'm going to start by asking you to take these packets they're stapled packets. They're in your folder. I think they're on the right side because we're going to reference a couple things in there. And there's a couple of op-eds I've written just to back up some of my remarks. So I wanted to start off today, and actually I want to share a story that was really cool this morning. So I am staying at the Pepperdine, what's it called, the Graziano or something? Graziano. And I called down to the front desk today and said, hey, would you mind printing out my remarks? I made some changes last night. And she said, sure. So I, got dressed, went downstairs, and she starts to hand me this, my remarks. And she's kind of hanging on, and all of a sudden there was a tear in her eye, and she said, oh, makes me teary myself. She said, I just want you to know, I hope you don't mind. I hope you're not offended that I read your remarks. I had to pull them up on the computer and to print them. And she said, I'm 2 years in recovery. I work at Pepperdine, and I run a sober living program for other women, and just got my daughter out to California. They're both from Oklahoma. And just got my daughter out, who was in prison and now is clean and sober for a year. So her name is Cheryl. Let's give her a round of applause. It was a very cool moment. So Stephen did such a great job, and Robert's going to do a great job, I know, spending a lot of time on the policy. I wanted to really focus on how things translate down at the grassroots level, at the ground level. As you heard from my introduction, I spent 13 years running a program called St. John's in Sacramento, California. When I started, I came out of the business world. I had no experience in this field whatsoever. And I was on loan, actually, from the California Chamber of Commerce, because St. John's at the time had basically was about to close its doors. And I just fell in love with the work and never left. I had been at the Chamber for 4 years. I went back in January, which is what Alan asked me to do, and I said, I'm sorry, but I'm not coming back. I really love this work at St. John's. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on how this translates, down to the front line. But I want to start with a little bit of personal business. So how many of you know women in their 50s? Good. So how many of you know that women in their 50s kind of get a little bit more heated than women in other stages of their lives? So and this is very personal business, but if you see me like gulping water or, running for the door to open it up, no, it's not because I'm bored with you. No, it's My time. So next, given that this discussion is happening, after lunch and after lots of great snacks, I'm going to ask some questions, and I just want your commitment that you're going to be responding to those questions out loud. Have fun with it, but I really want to understand your answers, but I also really want to know that you're still awake and with us, right? So just be prepared for those questions. So pull out that bell curve. I think it's page 2 in your packet. It's really important that we start with an understanding of the homeless population. And one of the frustrations I had, in my line of work, but also as I was writing the book and, starting to really venture into policy, one of my frustrations was government data paints a very different picture than what I was seeing on the ground level. Government data, some of you may know, it's the HUD pit count data. It, tracks it tracks race, it tracks, homelessness, what type of homelessness, right? But it doesn't, it really doesn't accurately, well, it doesn't track the count accurately, but it also doesn't track addiction and mental illness accurately. According to government data, 25 to 35% of the homeless are struggling with addiction and mental illness. So I created this bell curve, number one, to, frame for my readers the reality of what they're struggling with, but also to, put some numbers to it. So if you look at the left side of the bell curve, that's the chronically homeless population. By the way, this was done in 2020, so our data is going to be a little off. But it's somewhere, depending on where you are in the region, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the homeless, 10 and 20% of the homeless population, sorry. Again, that varies. It's going up in states like California in particular, where we're now home to 50% of the chronically homeless, the street homeless. But it is about 10 to 20%, right, overall. If you look on the right side of the bell curve, and this, I love the comments that someone made about media really not being our friend and telling the true story. Media loves to talk about the right side of the bell curve, which are the people who have been making it, but barely making it. They were living on the edge. A healthcare event happened. They lost their job because they couldn't go to work. Then they lost their housing. There's a variety of reasons why people might get pushed over the edge. That's somewhere around 10%. Again, might be rising with this economy, likely has risen a little bit. But what we're talking about when we talk about policy is the folks in the middle who are struggling largely with addiction, with mental illness, maybe less severe forms than those than the chronically homeless population. Generational poverty, domestic violence in the case of women and children. So I just use this as a way to frame our discussion today, but also as a way to frame the book. Any questions or comments on this? Okay, let's move on.
I noticed that there's some of the same issues on the far left and in the center. So maybe if you can differentiate.
Yes, and I'm sorry, that's what I just mentioned. The folks in the middle are still dealing with, again, generational poverty, domestic violence for women, addiction, mental health, and I'm about to go through some numbers here in a second. But they're probably less severe forms of mental illness and addiction than the chronically homeless, which is on the left side of the curve, right? So, but let me talk about the St. John's data. So St. John's was a program for women and children. I can't tell you how many times people have told me, women and children, that is the cream of the crop of the homeless. But let me tell you, that is not the case. So and by the way, we were the largest program in Northern California and one of the only ones that focused on women and children. 78% of our women struggled with addiction, about 60% with mental illness, 65% had criminal histories, 30% lost custody of their kids, 70% domestic violence. They had a myriad of issues with which they were struggling. But mental illness and addiction. So people will often say, and the UCLA Policy Lab, you guys probably have all seen that study, right? They did a deep dive into the government data and said, no, addiction and mental illness are much bigger problems in the homeless population. But that, in the chronically homeless population, our data, women and children, mirrored the St. John's data, the UCLA Policy Lab data. So anyway, the problems are much more significant than maybe many of you understand in terms of mental illness and addiction. Now, one thing I really want to stress, mental health clinicians and drug and alcohol counselors will tell you that brain development stops the minute, the day that people start using or that mental illness is triggered. We're going to go back to this point, but I'll just tell you at St. John's, most of our women started using between ages 9 and 13. With their mom, by the way. Most of them started using with their mom. So this is a really important point to return to, and we will. Speaking of this point, how many of you are familiar with the Benioff group? Okay. So they drive me a little bit crazy. You have to find humor in this work because it's so serious. But they spend all this time trying to convince us. There's two schools of thought in addiction and mental health as it relates to homelessness. One school is it leads to homelessness, and the other school is it's a result of. I can tell you in my experience with St. John's, it's both. However, the Benioff Institute spends tons of time to try and convince us that no, it didn't lead to anyone's homelessness. It is a result only of their homelessness, or largely. And that's just a pet peeve of mine, because that is not what I've seen at St. John's and on the ground level in many communities throughout the country. So it's a moot point, and we'll move on, because I have more important points to talk about than the Benioff Institute. So raise your hand. Remember, we all agreed that we were going to participate, right? Raise your hand if you know someone that struggles either with mental illness or addiction. Okay. CDC classifies both as brain disorders, diseases of the brain, and as we all know, diseases must be treated. So I'm going to ask you right now to close your eyes just for a couple minutes. Checking. Robert, that's you too. Okay. He's got his eyes closed. Imagine the person for whom you just raised your hand walking into a hospital to get the help he or she needs. Only upon arrival, there are no doctors, there are no nurses, therefore there's no medication being dispensed, no surgeries performed, no treatment is happening whatsoever. All that exists in that hospital are beds and a few intake and custodial workers. This is the homeless system we've created, and this is why it's failing at every turn. You can open your eyes. Wow. When I first arrived at St. John's, I get emotional because I love St. John's. We were a 30-day emergency shelter for women and children, like I said earlier. We had a handful of case managers, a handful of staff, but really we didn't provide any services. And what happened within, I'm not kidding you, a couple weeks of my being at St. John's, is we had a woman named Michele come in with her 2 boys. And a couple days later, a woman named Katie came in with her daughter, Tori. I'm still in touch. This was almost 20 years ago. I'm still in touch with these girls. I was shocked when I learned that Katie and Michele were sisters. But the bigger shock for me was to learn that 18 years earlier, when St. John's was located at a church, they were there with their mom. Wow. And it was at that point that I said, we can't just continue to provide emergency shelter and think that we are giving these women all they need to restore their lives. It was great work. I loved it. It made me leave the chamber. I had a great job on the 15th floor of the Esquire building, but it wasn't enough. So I pulled together our very small team, and the first thing we did was we created a definition of success. What do we want to drive to? Our definition of success was empower mothers to become the primary providers of their families. It took a while to get there, but I'm giving you the summary version. So what we then did, this is about 1 year in, is we started putting together, by the time we got this definition figured out, we started putting together what it would take to do that. And over the years, it was a constant evolution. We became a 12 to 18 month program that and I say this very deliberately, under one programmatic roof. We heard a lot of discussion earlier about how disconnected the system is. Even though we had 7 roofs when I left St. John's, we were all connected. Our staff met about our clients every Monday. Let me go back to the model. So we built this comprehensive model. It included case management from, very significantly trained mental health professionals. By the way, we didn't get one dime of public funding to do that. We built, we raised money to build that on our own. Drug and alcohol counseling. I built 2 restaurants and employment training program as hands-on employment training programs for the women. We had an awesome child care system. We had classes. We had AA and NA on site. We had we linked women after about 3 or 4 months to off-site groups, so they had that continuity when they left St. John's. We provided all the transportation. We had various stages of housing. And it was that comprehensive but connected program that I call our secret sauce, because every Monday our case managers were talking to the drug and alcohol counselor, who was talking to the child care person, who was talking to the employment training people, who were spending 8 hours a day with our women, whereas a case manager was spending 15, 20, 30 minutes, maybe an hour, as was the drug and alcohol counselor. And we looked at women and their children as together. And we were able to figure out a lot of issues, and there was no issue with sharing information because we were all connected under this programmatic roof. And that 12 to 18 month program has produced incredible outcomes. I'm going to share one story with you today. But I call them my, deathbed moments. Sheila, who came in off the river, who, ran into my office the minute she got off our shuttle from her first day her first week at work and her first paycheck, showing me her paycheck, right? When Natisha and Adriana became homeowners, single mothers who were at the bottom of the bottom when they came to us, who somehow in California, because we all know how ill-affordable it is, were able to rise to becoming homeowners. But I want to share in particular a story about Alicia, and it's really detailed, and I'll leave out details, so I'm going to read it. It's an excerpt from my book. At 9 years old, Alicia's mother's boyfriend began molesting her. Her mother did not believe Alicia and was convinced she had concocted the whole story for attention. Child Protective Services knew otherwise. They removed Alicia from the home she knew, but after being abandoned by her mother and after repeated foster care failures, the unaddressed trauma Alicia suffered understandably took its toll. Alicia became pregnant at 13. She endured one failed relationship after another, resulting in 9 children, 6 abortions, and a miscarriage, all on the public dole. Overcoming her decades of homelessness and pain seemed hopeless, but she found St. John's. In her early 40s, with a 25-year addiction, Alicia arrived to St. John's with 2 of her 9 children in tow. All 9 had been in the foster care system multiple times. 7 were eventually adopted out. At this point in her life, 40 years old, Alicia had never worked a day in her life. She is now in her 50s. She is over 10 years clean and sober. She's held the same job we put her into in 2014 with multiple raises and multiple promotions. She pays her own rent, she pays her taxes, she contributes to her 401k. I still talk to these people. It's just amazing to me. I love reading this. She enjoys a strong relationship with all 9 of her kids, 15 grandchildren, and 1 incredible great-grandchild. More importantly, she is now a role model for her family and for all of us in here. So let's, in spirit, give Alicia a round of applause.
What was the job?
She works at, it's called Pick and Pull, but she's risen up. She's on the admin side, so it's one of those places where, you can go in and find a muffler for I don't know, but she's doing really well, and that they have multiple franchises, so I don't know exactly what her role is now. But, to have never worked, obviously, and right, it's just such a great story. So I'm not suggesting at all that St. John's would be a one-size-fits-all approach to homelessness, nor am I suggesting that we were perfect. We were always a continual work in progress. But there's a point that's now clear as day to me, now that I've segued into the policy world and I can kind of look back. We must build a system, just as we did at St. John's, based on life's fundamental truths. Truths that have been tossed by the wayside in the federal government, followed by California's approach as they went all in on housing first as a one-size-fits-all approach. I am always very careful to say I don't criticize housing first. There is probably a role for housing first, but as a one-size-fits-all approach, it has not worked, and we're going to get back to that here in a little bit. So I want to ask a question. We're going to segue again. When your first grade teacher, because we all had this question by our first grade teachers, right? When your first grade teacher said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Just start yelling out those answers.
Baseball player.
Oh,
A nurse.
nurse?
Veterinarian.
Okay. Come on, I want to hear more. Robert, what did you want to be?
School at Pepperdine.
I wanted to help people.
Okay. Stephen, what did you want to be?
Public policy research.
Oh, really? That's incredible. So your answers, those of you who did answer, make it pretty clear. Human beings are designed for purpose. We all have this desire to be purposeful. None of you said you wanted to be homeless, addicted, dependent on government, and the homeless didn't wish for those things either. You answered with roles that have purpose, and we need to build a system that helps the homeless become purposeful again, instead of straitjacketing them into their disease and into dependency. Our nation's homeless system ignores this reality, the reality of the need for all of us to be productive, right? The homeless and all the rest of us. Number 2, human beings are designed to be in community. We've heard a lot today from Stephen. We're going to hear a lot from Robert. The nation's homeless system is built around permanent housing, around isolation, putting someone into a unit by themselves without any sort of wraparound services to support them. One of the ironies of this for me is that when people talk about, the criminalization of the homeless, and I don't agree with it either, but how criminal is it to sentence the homeless to solitary confinement, which is in essence what we're doing. We have gotten rid of congregate living environments, supportive living environments, and community is crucial to all of us. especially to those that are trying to recover. And where's Brian? Yeah, Brian and I had some great discussions about that a little earlier. So the third truth is that human beings either grow or they die. By providing lifelong housing with no expectations, the homeless system is not promoting growth. It doesn't provide a vision for growth. It doesn't provide the support for growth, nor the incentive for growth. Inherent in growth is that human beings must participate. They must make effort. You can't grow unless you make effort, and they must take some level of responsibility. I want to talk to you about a story that happened in 2017 that really underscores for me when I realized how wrong we've gone on this. I pulled in to the church parking lot, the church that actually started us, 25 years earlier. And I was there for a meeting. It was 5 o'clock. Our church hosted what was called Winter Congregate Shelter. I don't know if is everyone familiar with that? It's kind of, where a church hosts for a week and then another one hosts for a week. So it's almost 5 o'clock, and people were starting to line up in the church parking lot. And there was a man, as I was pulling in front of me, and, clearly he was getting ready to line up. And he was smoking a cigarette, and he didn't put it out, he threw it down on the ground. And I sat there for a moment. I was stunned, because this is a church that is providing you with a home for the next week. You're just lining up to start this journey. So I rolled down my window, and I said, "Excuse me, is that your cigarette?" Knowing full well it was. And he looked at me, and he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Who do you think is going to put that out for you? Are you expecting the church that's giving you a home for the next week to put this out for you? You need to take responsibility for that. This is your home." And he did not yell at me. He bent down, put it out, and put it in the trash can. But at that moment, I realized we had done something so fundamentally wrong in our system by not expecting and supporting growth and productivity and responsibility, So we need to restore that in our system because it's gone, or add it to our system because it's gone. My fourth truth is that human beings are designed to love and be loved. And I know this is largely a policy audience, but I have to tell you, this is such an important point, maybe the most important point. So as we built out our program, we had graduations on probably 3 or 4 times a year, where women, we got them in robes and gowns, and they graduated, they had jobs, and they were graduating to being able to take care of their families on their own. I am not kidding, and we always had speakers, and sometimes unplanned speakers, because these women are so excited to have their families in the audience and to be sharing their story. And almost all of them would say, "What St. John's did for me is they loved me until I learned to love myself." It was across the board, unequivocal, the number one thing I heard from them. And it's a really important point. I get it, the government can't do that, but government has to support that, and they have to work towards building that into a system that is deplete of any sort of that. So I'm going to segue now into some myths that we really need to address. Actually, I missed this. I'm going to segue into some myths we need to address. Number one myth is homelessness can be ended. This drives me bananas. Again, I really try and laugh about the system, right? I think all of you know when the administration in 2003 rolled out Housing First as its one-size-fits-all approach, I'm talking about the federal level.
2013, not 2003.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I said 2013. They promised it would end homelessness in a decade. We are now 2024, and we are at the highest point of homelessness ever recorded in our nation's history. Biblically, we know, the homeless are going to be with us. We just know, and I'm going to talk about the system in a little bit, but let's not set ourselves up for failure by saying we're going to end homelessness. Let's be realistic, and the language that I typically use, which you probably heard me use today, is reversing the crisis or turning it around. We're never going to end homelessness, and we just set ourselves up for failure and for a lack of confidence by people when we use that. Number 2 myth. There is a one-size-fits-all approach to homelessness. False. Okay? Think about this in terms of cancer. I mean, what if there was only one drug we made available to everyone who has cancer, no matter what their body type, no matter what type of cancer, no matter what their doctor wants to use to treat? Think about it in terms of education. What if there was only one type of school? What if there wasn't Pepperdine's Public Policy Institute, one of the only Christian schools to have, right? What if it was just one way to educate? And since we're enjoying such great weather, let's imagine all of us having to fit in the same type of bathing suit, right? This is like ridiculous. It's ludicrous, right? So there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Myth number 3. Everyone struggling with homelessness needs lifelong permanent housing. False. Not only is this false, it's an impossible dream. And I really want to describe to you how St. John's worked so you can see this. And it's how the whole homeless system used to work. At St. John's, we had a 300-person waiting list every day. For years we had that, and we grew and grew and grew, but we still maintained that waiting list. Almost every day, someone would leave St. John's, hopefully onto their own housing that they could pay for with their family, and they were, ready to go. In the first month, we lost a lot of people because they said, I don't want to deal with the rules, But most people exited St. John's, in that way. And so that made room for us to bring someone else in. And this happened on a, weekly, probably daily basis, depending on the week. Excuse me, that's the way our old homeless system used to work. We would move people into shelters or transitional housing, and there was a little bit of permanent housing, but there was an exit in everything, probably an exit in permanent housing, but people were leaving the door, making room for others. So we've been building and building and building more housing, but no one's leaving because we're providing them with lifelong housing. It's like what I called it, an impossible dream. It doesn't work, as we will talk about with the data, but it cannot work. Probably most importantly, it oppresses purpose, because we say there's no conditions for you to get that housing. There's nothing you need to do. You can continue to abuse drugs. You can continue to not work. You can continue to wallow in your disease and not be engaged in services, and you have that housing. It completely, I call it the most oppressive thing we've done in this century. So we really need to restore not only shelters and transitional housing, but communal housing, where people have community to support them that are working towards the same goals. And this has to be restored in our system. Myth number 4, once the homeless are stably housed, they'll request services. This is false. We talked earlier about the role of addiction, mental illness, and homelessness, diseases that need to be treated. But I want to talk to you a little bit about St. John's and the importance of requiring services in those initial months. When someone comes in struggling with addiction and mental illness, they do not have a high level of self-awareness. They are in a fog. And had we not required services, they came in knowing full well that we required services, right? There was no surprise. We told them everything that they would be expected to do. But in those first stages, in order for them to gain clarity and start to build self-awareness and start to work towards something different, we needed to require those services. I'll tell you, after after several months, depending on the woman and depending on her issues, there was no, Jamie, you need to get into that mental health appointment that you had at 3 o'clock. There was none of that because they saw the benefits of it, but they don't even know what they don't know. They've never been to counseling, many of them. They don't know they don't have a self-awareness, but they also don't know. So requirements, I'm not saying there should be requirements for everyone, though there are so many cases of that working well in different programs across the country. But we really need to think about how we're going to get people to the point where they can see more clearly and they can start to work on their lives. And being under the influence is not going to help that in any significant way. I talked earlier about, the clinicians saying that brain development stops the minute you start using or the minute that mental health illness is triggered. And so, this whole notion of it's compassionate to give them choice. How many of you, and let's take the case of St. John's, how many of you have raised 9 to 13-year-olds that you would allow to choose whether or not they were going to use drugs? How many of you would allow them to choose whether or not they were going to participate in chores or whether or not they were going to contribute in your... It's a fallacy that they're in a mindset to choose to engage. I also want to mention there's a disease called anosognosia. It is a deficit of self-awareness that many of those struggling with addiction, and the data is kind of mixed on this, but they say over 50%, if you're struggling with addiction and mental illness, you're likely struggling with this disease as well. So it's so hard without gaining clarity and getting the support around them to expect that they're going to be able to even start. It's hard to turn your life around. But to do that when you're under the influence and under that fog, it's impossible. So the other thing I want to mention on this point is, so there's a study out of Boston. Has anyone seen this study? I can give it to you. You guys can reach out to me. They followed the chronically homeless placed in housing where they could choose services for 14 years. Longest study we've seen thus far, at least that I'm aware of. After year 5, again, we're talking about the chronically homeless population. After year 5, nearly half had died. 35%, I think it was right around 35%, were actually still in the housing. There hasn't been, again, to my knowledge, another long-term study. This really shows the need, and they died, right? They died from their diseases, very likely, or from neglect. So we really need to reintroduce requirements into the system. Again, not as a one-size-fits-all necessarily, but they need to, especially in the early stages, be a part of our system. There's also a fallacy around this, and they'll say, oh, well, if Brian chooses services, he can go to the nonprofit that he's being served by, and he can request services. Well, let me just talk about the system here for a second. So St. John's, when I started, we were about $1 million in funding. 90% was relying on the government. When I left, we were $7.5 million of funding, and that government contract, which we had lost because we were all of a sudden considered to be too high barrier, that government contract was about 10% of our funding. So as I mentioned earlier, we got not one dime of government funding to provide mental health and drug and alcohol counseling and employment training, nothing, right? Most nonprofits in this space, with the exception of the faith-based ones, nonprofits, are very reliant on government funding. Some exclusively reliant. So, but HUD, in its wisdom, when it rolled out Housing First as a one-size-fits-all in 2013, they defunded services. There's no longer any funding available for those types of clinical services or even employment training. So if I'm reliant on HUD funding or exclusively reliant on HUD funding, if a client comes to me and says, I want services, I run behind the building and hope to God they don't remember that they requested that, because I have to go out and raise that money. I don't have a funding source for that. And most nonprofits that are really reliant on government funding are not very good at fundraising. So the whole idea that they can, go out and write a grant to you, Howard, they're not going to do it, right? They're just not, that's not how they work. So,
For the general public at large,
yeah.
especially the churches.
Yeah. So, this whole idea that, services are available, the homeless are not choosing, the nonprofits really don't want to provide them because they can't fund them. It's a real problem for them. We need to restore funding and service requirements. Myth 5, how am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Okay.
To get to 10 minutes of questions.
Okay, I'm almost done. Housing First as a one-size-fits-all approach works. Now, I'm going to ask you to take out this chart that I think was the first page in your packet. Robert, you're probably going to spend time on this, so I won't spend, you're not? Okay.
No,
I just assumed. So this is pre-pandemic data. I love to use pre-pandemic because a lot of people will use the pandemic as an excuse for the rise in homelessness. But as you'll see on this chart, the cake was baked well before the pandemic. So at the federal level on the left, when we shifted to Housing First in 2013, over this period, we increased permanent housing vouchers by 43%. We increased spending by 200%. And homelessness went up by 16%, 15.6% in the overall population, 20.5% in the population, the chronically homeless or street homeless. When we did the same in California in 2016. We increased the number of permanent housing vouchers by 33%. The only thing we could document was a 101% increase in spending. We know it was very high, it was much higher, but we could only document 101%. Unsheltered homelessness went up by 47% and 37% in the overall homeless population. So this whole notion that more housing, more affordable housing is the solution, it's completely debunked here. And as you probably are already aware, and we talked about this earlier, we're now at the highest point in the nation in homelessness. California is now home to 30% of the nation's overall homeless population and 50% of the unsheltered chronically homeless population. So let me run through what we need to do to get there. I was going to read another text I just got. I am going to just read this really quick. I got this from a client that I hadn't talked to, I hadn't seen in probably 7 or 8 years. So I use Facebook to keep in touch with a lot of our clients. She had a birthday. I wished her happy birthday, and I got this message back. Michele, I so appreciate the birthday wish. Thank you. You are my shiro. God has been good. I'm now a homeowner, work for Lending Tree, and life license for the state of California. Would not be where I am if it had not been for St. John's, your encouragement, most importantly, the love and resources and therapy, and the whole foundation of St. John's. I love you. I thank you. God bless you. This is possible. I wrote this book. I wrote my book because I really do have that hope. It's why I do the work I do. It's why I'm here with you today. Reminder, we must redefine success based on the core principles. Humans are designed for purpose. They're designed to be in community. They're designed to grow. They're designed to and for love. Knowing that where we focus, we drive, our focus must be on recovery and restoration of the homeless, which will in turn help our communities recover and be restored. It should not be about the numbers served. It should be about the numbers who no longer need service. That is a fundamental change that needs to happen. We must create and continually measure metrics based on our definition of success. So at St. John's, again, become the primary provider of your family. We developed metrics that we measured on a regular basis to measure our progress towards that goal and an individual's progress towards that goal. We must instill responsibility and accountability at every level of the system, the individual level, the nonprofit level, and local, state, and federal government level. We must restore innovation and local control. Innovation has died under this one-size-fits-all approach. We're not seeing programs like we used to see, like Haven for Hope that Robert started, like St. John. We're not seeing those come alive because we're very focused on this one-size-fits-all approach, right? So we need to restore that. We've also lost local control. HUD makes this look like a locally controlled system, but we all know this is a top-down system, and we need to change that. Homeless policy, and someone talked about this earlier, needs to factor in the individuals struggling with homelessness and the needs of the society surrounding them. Our policy today is completely unbalanced. Who was talking about that? Was you? Yeah. Our policy today is completely unbalanced. There's no consideration of the needs of the society. We've abandoned our parks and sidewalks. They're no longer safe. It's ludicrous. Soledad, where's Soledad? Saw your post about the RVs that have been parked on that public sidewalk for 3 years. It's horrible. Policy also must focus on the effects on our children who are now seeing these tents. They're walking over needles. They are watching zombies who are, publicly using drugs, bent over. I mean, that has to be a horror film for these kids, and we're not focused on balancing this out. We need to be focused on the personal safety aspects. We heard about the gentleman in the New York subway, and there's been so many incidents of that and many others. And the effects on businesses. I mean, we've seen businesses go away all across the country, in San Francisco in particular. We're losing Macy's on Union Square, which is where we used to go every year as a family. We must re-engage law enforcement and the faith-based communities. Both have been ostracized. And I want to use an example. Andy gave me permission, Andy Bales, who used to run Union Rescue Mission, and he gave me permission to share this study. When Mayor Bass came in, she was Andy spent a lot of time with her. She was really enthralled with the program, the results they were getting. She said, we're getting some new funding, and I'm going to give you X million to run a clean and sober program.
2.3 million.
Thank you. And pretty soon,
23 billion.
yeah, pretty soon, Andy was not getting callbacks. And that money went to someone else. We have got to include, a variety of players, the faith-based community in particular. Remember, they held the reins of responsibility on this for so long, and they have been ostracized, and we need to bring them back in. We need their partnership. We need law enforcement. We had some discussion today, but let me tell you, law enforcement, yes, there's a lot of training that's needed, but they are often that bottom point. I mean, Tom Wolf, Ellen knows Tom Wolf. I mean, it was law enforcement who finally said, how many times am I going to have to arrest you? You can do so much better. So we need to use them. We need to incorporate them. And we must push for federal policy change. I won't, they're the predominant source of funding. They drive local policy. They drive funding in so many places. We have some legislation that Representative Barr has put forward. It's his second time. He has over 30 sponsors. But guess who he doesn't have? He doesn't have Democrats, because guess who told the Democrats they should not sign on to any Housing First reform? Maxine Waters, who is looking at this on a daily basis and will not reform this policy. So this is the path to effectively addressing homelessness. I thank you for being here and being a part of this journey with all of us.
So just being mindful that we've got some time to chat afterwards as well, but I just wanted to leave 5 minutes here if there are some immediate questions, reflections. Yes?
So you mentioned the exit plan, and you also mentioned I think it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, going back to the communal housing. You know,
Hey, guys.
so I was confused about the communal housing. If a person is already housed in a permanent housing situation, maybe I misunderstood what you were
Yeah, what I was meaning to say is, right now, there's, communal housing largely has been left out of the mix. You know, it's, at one point, okay, and it needs to be in the mix. I mean, people who are struggling with these issues need to be around other people. We all need love, we all need community, and I'm just saying, put it back in the mix.
Okay.
Yeah,
There's an organization called Shared Collaborative Housing in Culver City down here. And
Okay.
It's a really effective program. In the beach cities, we're using it as our primary source of housing people. And it allows them to be, people to be in a community of sane people working, living independently, working towards bettering their lives.
Yeah.
But also being provided the opportunity to access resources. It's a great program.
okay, thank you for letting me know. Share community resource. Oh, is that yours, Brian? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I have his card, so I'll be following up. Any other?
Yeah, one more.
We've been talking a little bit today about, getting more options to the table, or having more options for people. And so I was gonna ask the mayor, how do you, and you, how did you become an option that got elevated to a conversation, or was a part of a community to solve the problem? I think a lot of times faith-based groups especially, they can't get to the table.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering how you got there, or, from the mayor's perspective, how do groups get to the table?
Well, I think I'll just speak from my perspective. We created a vision, and we created a program around that vision. And I didn't come out of, this space. As I mentioned, I was in politics for the chamber, and I knew how to raise money. And I went to all my friends who gave me money at the chamber for political campaigns, and I said, I need your money for this. And it grew, and as we shared our results and engaged the community further, again, we went from $1 million budget to $7.5 million. That included, by the way, Stephen, I just wanted to support you on one of the points you made. We were asked by the Department of Corrections in California to replicate our program for women and children transitioning from prison, so some of that money came for that program. But the reason the Department of Corrections came to us is because there are so many parallels between the two populations and the restorative process that needs to happen with women.
The only thing I would add is eliminating those requirements that the government has to be hands-off from faith-based is absolutely essential. Some of the best work that's happening in San Diego right now, through a group of San Diego Rescue Mission.
Okay, yeah,
That
I'm
is
familiar with that.
really focused on rehabilitation and intervention. And their success rate, right, and we're all looking for success, is off the chart.
Yeah.
So why would we say we're not going to work with a group
Yeah.
that's turning around so many lives? So the answer has to be, don't just say from a government standpoint, I'm not going to work. I don't care what your denomination, I don't care what if you're helping people get well,
Yep.
I want you to do more of that in my city.
Yep.
Please join me in thanking Michele.